Looks like there are about 90 people so far.
That's great. Okay, shall I slowly begin? Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending where you are. Just want to say right at the top that we are recording this session, so everybody is aware of that. And we hope that we will be able to make it available in due course on our website. I want to just say a little bit about the Centre for Philosophy and Critical Theory at Goldsmiths before I introduce our speaker for today. So the Centre for Philosophy and Critical Theory is a research centre at Goldsmiths here in London that brings together faculty and students interested in philosophy from across the university. The centre runs an annual reading group that runs throughout the year, and this year we have the theme of critiques of violence, and it runs every other week during term time. We also have an annual conference, or we usually have an annual conference, although the latest one, which will be or was going to be on tragedy, has been postponed, so it will now happen hopefully sometime in the future. We also have an annual lecture, and we have a series of talks, of which this one is a part, to which we invite speakers, and that runs across the year. So you can sign up for information about all of these things on our website, which you must have found already, but is www.cpct.uk. So let me turn to our speaker today. I'm very excited to welcome Professor Eric Santner, who is the Philip and Ida Romber Distinguished Service Professor of Modern Germanic Studies at the University of Chicago. He's the author of a number of books, which are interconnected books, I think it's fair to say, that explore the boundary zones between philosophy, literature, and psychoanalysis. And they do so from his book, My Own Private Germany, which was published in 1997 by Princeton, which was an analysis of the writings of Daniel Paul Schreiber as a kind of nerve Bible of its historical moment, through to On Creaturely Life, Rilke, Benjamin, and Sebald, where he explores the particular form of exposure that constitutes the process of becoming creaturely, and to the wonderful The Royal Remains, The People's Two Bodies and the End Games of Sovereignty, a book which is a particular favourite of mine, and that considers what happens to the king's second body with the modern notion of the people as sovereign. It is a subtle and fascinating book that repays close study and revisiting, and I recommend it to you and all of them to you. So I've admired Professor Santner's work for some time now for its detailed, careful and inventive readings that bring together texts, often ones that you thought you knew, into surprising new juxtapositions and formulations. So it's no surprise I've been wanting Eric to visit Goldsmiths for some time, and I've been chasing him to arrange this. Sorry about that, Eric. But I'm really, truly delighted today that he can join us, if only via the technology of Zoom. So today, Eric will address some work in progress, and he'll say a little bit more about that, part of a forthcoming work. He's going to speak for 45 to 50 minutes. And then my lovely colleagues, Josh Cohen and Julia Ng from the Department of English and Comparative Literature, will respond and start the conversation for us. We ask you, please, if you would put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to pose as many of these questions as we have time for at the end before our time is up. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Eric Santner, who will be speaking under the title Canine-ical Theory on Kafka's Researches of a Dog. Eric, thank you.
So Julia, are you guys going to stay there or disappear? I can't remember.
We'll stay here on your screens and
okay, yeah. Okay, that's fine, because it's
but
otherwise
people
it,
see just you. People will see
okay.
just you, right?
Okay,
Is it distracting, Tavas?
okay, there I am. Well, Vicky, thank you so much. Julia, thank you so much. Josh, and to the center, I really appreciate this chance to share new work, relatively new work. This is a small piece of a chapter of a larger book, which should come out next year with University of Chicago Press. The title is Untying Things Together, Philosophy, Literature, and a Life in Theory. It was originally planned on being a small book where I would just play with the title of Freud's famous book on sexuality, and it was going to be called 3 Essays on the Sexuality of Theory. And the thought was, I felt that Freud's understanding of sexuality as presented in the 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality actually give a good sense of why theory, high theory, became so important in the academy over the the last how many decades. I wanted to talk about what the status of theory between philosophy, or as the border of philosophy, the border of literary criticism, and try to find out what's distinctive about it. And as I tried to do that, it turned out that the whole thing became, I found that the best way to do it was in a kind of, by way of an autobiographical intellectual history, basically telling the story of how I came to my encounters with these different theories, major theorists, books, teachers, works of art, and how that formed my understanding of what theory is, and in a certain sense, the right way to do it. This becomes, I think, actually, this project I didn't realize, I think, becomes more urgent in the present moment when we're talking about being post-critical. And there's a kind of, a return, or at least some sense of a return to the experiential, to the affective, to the, well, in a way, to the autobiographical. So in some sense, I'm part of it. In some sense, I think I'm also resisting it somewhat. This piece is part of a chapter where I try to engage with Kafka's very strange late story, never published by him, The Researches of a Dog, which I call canonical, not canonical, but canine-ical theory. Okay, I'll begin. In the summer of 2019, Kenneth Reinhardt and I were invited to give keynote lectures at a conference on neighbor love at the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters, History, and Antiquities. The conference was scheduled to be held in April 2020, but was, of course, canceled in the wake of the pandemic. It turned out that the best way to love one's neighbor in the time of COVID was to isolate oneself, or if that wasn't possible, to maintain social distancing, while the famous face of the other was ideally covered by a mask. Ken and I owed our invitation to the work we did together along with Slavoj Žižek on a book devoted to the topic of the neighbor. The co-authored volume attempted to revisit the biblical injunction to love one's neighbor, but to do so in a Freudian spirit. That is, to see what psychoanalysis might have to offer with respect to the meaning and stakes of this imperative in general, and for our contemporary moment in particular. We were all well aware of Freud's own considerable skepticism about the commandment, the skepticism that pertained to a neighbor in one's own community, as well as, and no doubt more strongly, to a stranger or a foreigner who enters into our midst, who appears right next to us. Much, of course, depends on the nature of the proximity indicated by that little word. In German, the neighbor in the biblical sense is der Nächste, the one who is just next to me, the next one. In both instances, that is, the neighbor in our community and the neighbor a stranger, the neighbor remains, now I lost page 2. There it is. The neighbor remains utterly, even threateningly alien to Freud. One could, of course, say that Freud's attitude should not be surprising, considering that what is at issue here is, after all, a divine commandment, one that truly carries force only for a person of faith, for someone who recognizes the word of God in the commandment. For a non-believer like Freud, it represents a moral generosity toward one's fellows who are, for the most part, undeserving of love or special kindness. As Freud writes, I must honestly confess that the neighbor has more claim to my hostility and even my hatred. He seems not to have the least trace of love for me and shows me not the slightest consideration. If it will do him any good, he has no hesitation in injuring me, nor does he ask himself whether the amount of advantage he gains bears any proportion to the extent of the harm he does to me. Indeed, he need not even obtain an advantage if he can satisfy any sort of desire by it. He thinks nothing of jeering at me, insulting me, slandering me, showing me his superior power. And the more secure he feels, the more helpless I am. And the more helpless I am, the more certainly I can expect him to behave like this to me. End of quote. The commandment remains especially alien to Freud against the backdrop of what had at this point in his thinking concluded about the psychic makeup of human beings as, quote, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness, he writes. Their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture him, to kill him. Homo homini lupus. End of quote. Now I'm having trouble. These words were taken from the 1930 essay Unbehagen in der Kultur, Civilizations and Its Discontents, where Freud puts forth the paradoxical thesis that man is a wolf to his fellow man, not because of some failure on the part of civilization to fully tame his bestial nature. The bestial element in man is seen rather to be, in some sense, Adorno and Horkheimer called it a dialectical sense, a byproduct of the civilizing process itself. Civilization, whose fundamental aim is typically seen as the development of a degree of immunity against dangers assailing life from the outside, is, Freud argues, so constituted that it inevitably begins to attack itself in autoimmune fashion, much like the disease entity that goes by the name lupus. To put it in different biblical terms, what makes man a lupus to his fellow man is precisely what sets him apart from the animal kingdom: his sinful fallen nature, his original deviation from his divinely created nature. As the biblical traditions would have it, this is, of course, what also makes possible the emergence of the kingdom of God. I'm tempted to say the royal neighborhood of God, in which our various immune systems against external and internal aliens have been finally rendered inoperative. This language has particular resonance against the backdrop of the crisis that led to the cancellation of the conference, the global spread of a virus itself bearing a kind of crown. Some 8 years before Freud wrote Unbehagen, Franz Kafka, a fellow German Jewish survivor of the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, wrote a remarkable prose text published posthumously under the heading Forschungen eines Hundes, Researches of a Dog. As in all of Kafka's animal studies, this one too serves as a kind of allegory that makes visible something distinctly human, which in Kafka's case typically overlaps with traits associated with assimilated Central European Jews. It's a dense and difficult text, and I won't venture any sort of comprehensive reading here, but try instead to underline a few features that will helpfully bring us into greater conceptual proximity to the neighbor. I should mention, I want to plug a friend's book, Aaron Schuster, with whom I co-authored a book recently with yet another author, is working on a book and should be finished soon, How to Research Like a Dog, Kafka's New Science, which is coming out with MIT Press. The story, now it's just Kafka, the story is presented as a kind of memoir of an aging dog reflecting on his choice as a young dog to pursue the life of the mind, one dedicated to research, to a kind of theoretical activity, rather than sharing in the common life of dogs. It was actually only just recently that I realized that my little autobiographical intellectual history is actually in some ways a kind of research. It very much resonates with this story. I hadn't realized it. He confesses that this choice set him on a difficult path. Why won't I behave like the others, live in harmony with my kind, silently accept whatever disturbs that harmony, overlook it as a little mistake in the great reckoning, and turn forever toward what binds us happily together, and not toward what, time and again, irresistibly, of course, tears us out of the circle of our kind. In hindsight, the narrator dog seems to realize that such disturbances to the harmony of dogdom, calls it Hundeschaft, point not to contingent and determinate errors, but to a more fundamental errancy grounded in a structural glitch in the constitution of the species. On closer scrutiny, I soon found that something was not quite right from the beginning, that a little fracture, eine kleine Bruchstelle, was in place. He notes that a slight uneasiness, ein leichtes Unbehagen, would come over him not only in the midst of the collective, but also in more intimate settings. Indeed, that the mere sight of another dog could throw him into a sense of helplessness and despair. Call it Unbehagen in der Hundekultur. He goes on to recall the event that first set him on the course of his researches. It was an encounter with a group of 7 dogs who engage in a kind of dance set to a clamorous music that seems to come from nowhere, a kind of music ex nihilo. They did not speak, they did not sing. In general, they held their tongue with almost a certain doggedness. I mean, the German, mit einer gewissen Verbissenheit. But they conjured forth music out of the empty space. He recalls the way they raised and set down their feet, certain turns of their heads, their running and their resting, the attitudes they assume toward one another, the combinations they form with one another like a round dance. At a certain point, the music becomes overwhelming. You could attend to nothing but this music that came from all sides, from the heights, from the depths, from everywhere, pulling the listener into its midst, pouring over him, crushing him, and even after annihilating him, still blaring its fanfares at such close range that they turned remote and barely audible. In solche Nähe, dass es schon ferne war. The young narrator dog retreats to a pile of wooden planks and from his hiding place observes how the performance takes a new and horrifying turn. The 7 dogs, quote, had truly cast off all shame and stand upright on their hind legs. Quote, they were exposing themselves and openly flaunting their nakedness. They prided themselves on it. And whenever they obeyed their better instincts for a moment and lowered their front legs, they were literally horrified, as if it were a mistake, as if nature were a mistake. And once again, they rapidly raised their legs and their eyes seemed to be asking for forgiveness that they had to desist a little from their sinfulness. Dass sie in ihrer Sündhaftigkeit ein wenig hatten innehalten müssen. The young narrator dog's obsession with this for him deeply enigmatic, not to say traumatic, encounter is what ultimately alienates him from dogdom It sets him on this course as a researcher with the aim of, as he puts it, solving it absolutely by dint of research, so as finally to gain a new view of ordinary, quiet, happy, everyday life. And here, I'm not sure about the translation. The German is den Blick endlich wieder frei zu bekommen. So it's not exactly clear if it's in order to gain a view of ordinary, happy, everyday life, or in order finally to have my view freed, so I could just look back at ordinary, everyday life. So it's a little ambiguous. Stanley Korngold goes for the first, that his research will give him a view of a new view of ordinary, quiet, happy, everyday life. As he then adds, I have subsequently worked the same way, even if with less childish means, but the difference is not very great. I persist stubbornly to this day. Be that as it may, the dogged pursuit of a sort of absolute canine knowledge begins with questions close to hand, questions pertaining to the most basic needs of canine life. I began my investigations at that time with the simplest things. I began to investigate what dogdom took as nourishment. Now, one could actually, there's even a parallel here to the phenomenology of spirit, where absolute knowledge, absolute spirit, begins with just sense certainty. And for the dog, sense certainty is just eating. But the goal is some sort of absolute knowledge. The research concerns the question of the source of food, where food comes from. Does it come from the earth? Does it come down from the sky? Can dogs influence the appearance of food? Though these are questions that have apparently concerned canine scholars for generations, our young researcher, admitting the limits of his capacity for proper scientific knowledge, pursues such questions more or less on his own, without consulting the authoritative, call them canonical sources. A first conclusion would have it that dogs' main foodstuff indeed comes from the earth, but that for still unknown reasons, the earth needs dogs to help with its production. Quote, we find this food on the ground, but the ground needs our water. He adds that the appearance of food has been known to be accelerated by means of, quote, certain incantations, songs, and movements. Later in the story, our canine researcher entertains an opposing opinion, one seemingly supported by empirical experience, that food comes not from the ground, but rather from above, and is only brought down to earth by way of said canine rituals. At this point in the story, if not much sooner, the reader recognizes the fundamental conceit, namely that the dogs live amidst human beings who for some reason remain invisible to them. Put another way, the dogs live as if human beings did not exist, and are thus forced to contend with a multiplicity of phenomena that must remain enigmatic to them, or can be explained only by way of empirically noted regularities. Dogs pee, dogs find food on the ground. Dogs howl, bark, moan, the so-called incantations. Dogs find food on the ground. The story's conceit becomes completely obvious when the narrator dog, discussing the odd variety of occupations in which dogs are employed, mentions the air dogs, the Lufthunde, which is, I mean, the phrase comes from Luftmensch, which is, a German and actually more Yiddish expression for a dreamy, impractical person with no visible means of subsistence. But here clearly, the Lufthunde clearly refers to small lap dogs who, instead of being walked, are carried about by their invisible masters. Known to the narrator only by hearsay, he expresses his incredulity that, quote, it was supposed to be a dog of the smallest breed, not much bigger than my head, even in the most advanced age, not much bigger. And this dog, naturally a weakling, to judge by appearances, an artificial, immature, overly coiffed creature, incapable of taking an honest jump, This dog, the story went, was supposed to move about most of the time high in the air while doing no visible work. In hindsight, it becomes clear that the encounter that set him on his path as a researcher was with a group of trained dogs performing, perhaps in a park or public square, to the accompaniment of human musicians. We feel confident that the answer to the original enigma, quote, who was forcing them to do what they were doing here, is a straightforward one. They're human masters. Returning to the main question the narrator dog pursues, namely where food comes from, the story would seem to suggest that the Bruchstelle, the fracture in the constitution of dogdom, is connected to the lack of a concept of providence. That is, that food is provided for them by the good graces of human beings, that they are, as domestic animals, dependent on human care and nurturance. One might think of it as a thought experiment. What happens when a region of being is foreclosed from one's picture of the world? Kafka seems here to be revealing in allegorical fashion the sorts of uncanny enigmas and paradoxes that emerge once divine being, once revelation has been foreclosed from human life, no longer figures as a central point of reference and orientation in the world. Once man becomes, to coin a phrase, ungodded. The texture of ordinary life comes to be ruptured by a series of impossible questions that, as it were, hound human life without hope of domestication by either the natural or the human sciences. This is, I want to suggest, at least part of what is in play in Freud's perplexity with respect to the neighbor and the commandment of neighbor love. It's as mysterious as the spectacle of the 7 dogs dancing to a music that seems to come from nowhere, as the appearance of food for a dog whose ontology has no place for the being of human being and who bark and howl into an empty sky. As I've noted, the narrator in Kafka's story, excuse me. The narrator dog in Kafka's story considers himself to be poorly trained and without special talent for the researches he undertakes. He later speaks of his, quote, lack of propensity for science, scant intellectual power, poor memory, and above all, inability to focus consistently on a scientific goal. I have to say, I also identify somehow secretly with that. Nonetheless, he devises a series of experiments meant to grasp the causal chain that leads to the appearance of food, to catch it in action, as it were. After several efforts with uncertain outcomes, he decides to undertake a more radical experiment, to withdraw from the society of his fellow dogs, and more importantly, to fast, as if only the most radical ascetic practice, starvation, could clear the space for true knowledge about what keeps dog kind alive. I want to say, what keeps dog kind alive? You know, in the 3-penny opera version. At the point where our canine hunger artist, Kafka wrote the story bearing that title the same year, 1922, at the point where he has reduced himself to a minimum of bare life, to life in the neighborhood of zero, we might say, you know, he awakens to find himself confronted by another dog who demands that he remove himself from the area. In the course of the dialogue that ensues, the strange dog declares his breed, I am a hunter, and continues to insist that our narrator dog is interfering with his work and must leave. At a point of stalemate, something remarkable occurs that though the narrator dog will later attribute it to his quote, overstimulation at the time, nevertheless had a certain grandeur and is the sole reality, even if only an apparent reality, that I salvaged and brought back into this world from the time of my fast. It was a moment of ecstasy of außer sich sein, accompanied by, quote, infinite anxiety and shame, end of quote, produced by a second encounter with music ex nihilo. I noticed through intangible details that from the depths of his chest, this dog was getting ready to sing. Though the hunting dog appears to remain silent, a music emerges nonetheless. Quote, what I seem to perceive was that the dog was already singing without his being aware of it. No, more than that, that the melody detached from him was floating through the air and then past him according to its own laws, as if he no longer had any part in it, floating at me, aimed only at me. But at this point in the story, the reader is already clued in, already prepared to attribute the music not to the narrator dog's hypersensitivity brought on by fasting, but rather to human hunters blowing their hunting horns. And though this musical epiphany remains empty of content, the narrator dog, as already noted, nonetheless registers its uncanny force as an interpolation addressed to him only, now as a kind of overwhelming Orphic voice. What is Orphic voice, quote, I could not resist the melody that the dog now quickly seemed to adopt as his own. It grew stronger. There may have been no limits to its power to increase. It was already on the verge of shattering my eardrums. Schon jetzt sprengte sie mir fast das Gehör. But the worst of it was that it seemed to be there for my sake alone. This voice, this sublimity made the woods grow silent, whose sublimity made the woods grow silent for my sake alone. And other readers have noted that this seems to resonate with the experience of the man before the law, who learns that the gatekeeper was meant for him, that this gate to the door, this gate to the law was meant for him alone. At this point, it is hard, at least for me, not to hear in this voice resonances with the debate between Walter Benjamin and Gershom Scholem concerning the status of revelation in Kafka's writings. The central point of contention between the two friends concerns the status of theological trace elements in Kafka's work. Scholem insists that Kafka's work is suffused with the radiance of revelation, but a revelation, as he puts it, quote, seen from the perspective in which it is returned to its own nothingness. Scholem will later characterize this nothingness of revelation as, quote, a state in which revelation appears to be without meaning, in which it still asserts itself, in which it has validity but no significance, indem sie gilt aber nicht bedeutet. A revelation reduced to the 0 point of its own content, so to speak, end of quote. For Kafka, what I said earlier with respect to Freud's relation to the commandment of neighbor love needs a slight but significant revision. A divine commandment, I said, is one that only truly carries force for a person of faith, for someone who recognizes the word of God in the commandment. Kafka seems to offer another possibility, namely that it is possible to register the force of a commandment, the content of which approaches 0. Here I just, I listened on YouTube not that long ago to a lecture by Dieter Thomé, the philosopher who teaches in Switzerland, on Heidegger, and his basic argument that all of Heidegger is an attempt to reduce speech to a pure imperative, of contentless imperative, of being. That in a certain sense, he's trying to purify the imperative over the course of his career. Anyway, the canine version of this nothing, this nichts der Offenbarung, this nothing of revelation, conveyed by a disembodied voice, a sort of floating signifier of transcendence that could nonetheless take residence in a particular dog, become the music of the other in it, leads to a new turn in the researches of the narrator dog. After this second musical encounter of the story, and this comes almost at the end of the story, call it, with a nod to Wagner, a Musiktrauma. So I think he experiences two Musiktraumas. He feels new life entering his body, and more importantly, a new sense of his proper vocation, a call to engage in a new branch of scientific research, musicology, call it Musikwissenschaft als Beruf. So he's kind of a Weberian too. More importantly, he finally realizes that the science of nutrition and the science of music overlap at a crucial juncture, one about which he already had some inklings at the time of his first musical encounter. Quote, of course, there is some overlap between the two sciences, ein Grenzgebiet der beiden Wissenschaften, that even then, that is the first encounter, aroused my suspicions. I mean, the doctrine of the song that calls down food from above. End of quote. Again, the both more and less mysterious reading would be that the various sorts of vocalizations produced by domestic animals can move their owners to feed them, right? The dogs bark, okay, I see you're hungry. I'll throw down some food. I'll give you a bone. I'll put some food in your bowl. The mystery here is that it is a mystery for the dogs, how this works, that the domestic sphere has become a site of a humanitas absconditus. These last thoughts about the border zone of the two sciences, where the two sciences neighbor on one another, lead immediately to the narrator's dog concluding words that repeat the theme of his lack of talent for proper science. But now, at the very end of his autobiographical reflections, he seems ready to fully embrace this lack as rooted in an instinct for a different mode of inquiry, for the development of an entirely new kind of science, a kind of new thinking, a new canine thinking. And here I'm alluding to Franz Rosenzweig's concept of the new thinking, which he elaborated around the same time as Kafka published this story, as Kafka wrote this story. And this is the end of the last words of Kafka's story. It was my instinct that perhaps precisely for the sake of science, but a different science than is practiced today, an ultimate science, led me to value freedom above all else. Freedom, of course, the freedom that is possible today, a stunted growth, ein kümmerliches Gewächs, but nevertheless freedom, nevertheless a possession. So that's the end of the Kafka story. I mean, you could hear already the resonances with my thinkings about theory, that it's and its odd place in the academy. Does it belong in a particular discipline? Is it a do we do it because the people who do it because we don't really our capacity for these other sciences just isn't isn't good enough, or is it because we have an instinct for a new kind of science, something that is connected to freedom? At the conclusion of his inspiring reading of Kafka's canonical text, Miladin Dolar suggests that it was Kafka's neighbor, Freud, who had already begun to develop the warp and woof, and I like to say the warp and woof of this ultimate science, at least science of at least a kind of freedom, a freedom rooted in the border territory where nutrition and music, food and voice seem to converge and diverge at the same time, where the locus of nutrition, the mouth, tongue, teeth, become, by a kind of intermittent fasting, the locus of the articulation of sounds, as every child is taught one shouldn't speak with one's mouth when one's mouth is full. So you have to fast, as it were, to speak. Giving a psychoanalytic twist to Deleuze and Guattari's characterization of this deterritorialization of the mouth, Dolar puts it this way: by speech, the mouth is denaturalized, diverted from its natural function, seized by the signifier, and by the voice, which is but the alterity of the signifier. The Freudian name for this deterritorialization is the drive. Eating can never be the same once the mouth has been deterritorialized. It is seized by the drive. It turns around a new object which emerged in this operation. It keeps circumventing, circling around this eternally elusive object. Our efforts to reterritorialize this object, to integrate the alterity of the voice into our life in the space of meaning, never comes off without a remainder. As Dolar puts it, but this secondary nature can never quite succeed, and the bit that eludes it can be pinned down as the element of the voice, this pure alterity of what is said. This is the common ground it shares with food, that in food which precisely escapes eating, the bone that gets stuck in the gullet. Now here, Dolar is in large measure repeating with respect to the voice Freud's famous account of thumb sucking, first presented in the 1905 treatise, 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. There, Freud locates the birth of sexuality in the way in which a semi-autonomous autoerotic activity splits off from its place and purpose in the homeostatic regulation of the organism. Before homing in on the event of that split, Freud first calls into question what, with respect to sexuality, we seem naturally to see as the norm and normally see as natural. In the first essay, which addresses what he refers to as the sexual aberrations, die sexuellen Abirrungen, Freud offers a rather stunning formulation of an errancy he's discovered to be constitutive of sexual object choice, of the drive's deviation from its ostensibly destined natural object. It has been brought to our notice that we have been in the habit of regarding the connection between the sexual instinct and the sexual object as more intimate than it in fact is. Experience of the cases that are considered abnormal has shown us that in them, the sexual instinct and the sexual object are merely soldered together. A fact which we have been in danger of overlooking in consequence of the uniformity of the normal picture, where the object appears to form part and parcel of the instinct. We are thus warned to loosen the bond that exists in our thoughts between instinct and object. It seems probable that the sexual instinct is, in the first instance, independent of its object, nor is its origin likely to be due to the object's attractions. It's a famous passage from the first essay in the 3 Essays. The cause of the drive's attachments would thus seem to be something other than the object, or rather an otherness in the object itself, something in the object that exceeds that object's properties. That is, all that can be accounted for by one predicate or another. The drive functions, we might say, according to a kind of apophantic or negative ontology, in analogy with the doctrine of negative theology, which posits God's essence beyond propositional knowledge. What arouses sexual desire is something in the object that is strangely independent of the object, a part that has no part in it, in a word, a partial object to which desire finds itself to be singularly partial. The object of the drive is, with a nod to Robert Musil, the object without qualities. So we have the negative theology, in a certain sense, God without qualities, and now we have the object of sexualities, in a certain sense, the object without qualities. In the second essay, which is dedicated to infantile sexuality, Freud uses the example of thumb sucking, lutschen, ludeln, Wonnesaugen, all translated as sensual sucking, to illustrate the way in which a new and surprising satisfaction emerges at the site of nursing, an activity that satisfies the demands of homeostatic imperative of the organism. With Kafka's dog in mind, we might say that the object of the science of food thereby becomes the object of Freud's new science, the science of libido and its modes of production and circulation, the science of libidinal economy. Here it is not a question of object choice, but rather of the splitting of the object into itself and something in it that bears its libidinal value. something that, as Freud earlier suggests, can wander, can come to light upon seemingly aberrant objects, endowing them with it, the real thing that really satisfies. As Freud proposes, at the point of its emergence, thumb-sucking represents the infant's attempt to recapture a sensation of pleasure already experienced. It is easy, he writes, to guess the occasion on which the child had his first experience of the pleasure, which he is now striving to renew. It was the child's first and most vital activity, his sucking at his mother's breast or at substitutes for it, that must have familiarized him with this pleasure. The child's lips, he continues, behave like an erotogenic zone, and no doubt stimulation by the warm flow of milk is the cause of the pleasurable sensation. That pleasure, as noted, gains a kind of semi-autonomy, becomes wayward. Again, Freud, the satisfaction of the erotogenic zone is associated in the first instance with the satisfaction of the need for nourishment. To begin with, sexual activity attaches itself to, in the German is lehnt sich an, sort of, I think it's generally translated, is anaclitic upon, leans upon functions serving the purpose of self-preservation and does not become independent until later. The need for repeating the sexual satisfaction does, though, become detached from the need for taking nourishment. Okay, Freud's account of the emergence of the libidinal object, the object invested with libidinal value. So I went, I've been showing these homologies of arguments. Freud's account of the emergence of the libidinal object more or less maps onto the way in which Aristotle describes the emergence of prematistics, the art of making money. There too, something detaches itself from its own purpose, from its functional role in the management of the household, the oikos. For Aristotle, making money for the sake of making money represents a deviation from a perversion of the primary function of money, that is, to enable the commerce necessary for the provision of the household. For Marx, of course, prematistics acquires a new source of energy in modern capitalism, the possibility of exploiting so-called free labor, of consuming that unique commodity, labor power, for the production of surplus value. For Marx, this marks the shift from merchant's capital to capital proper. The capitalist, qua capitalist, must at some level be indifferent to the use values of the commodities he produces. For what is at issue here is the repetition of the production of a surplus value, a supplementary satisfaction that attaches itself to, that leans on, is anaclitic on, the production of commodities, the use values of which fulfill some need or want. So here now we have labor without qualities. Labor without qualities, Marx calls it abstract homogeneous human labor, is converted into commodities without qualities, commodities as pure quantities of value. More precisely, capital discovers a new satisfaction at the point at which the laborer has, by adding use value to raw materials, earned what allows for living and working another day. The capitalist, however, discovers that he can continue sucking more labor out of the laborer, and that the additional use value thereby produced becomes surplus value, accruing only to the capitalist. Sucking more sucking, come to be the primary activity, the raison d'etre of the capitalist existence. In a word, capitalism really does suck. It really does. Okay, so I'm coming to the end. I'd like to conclude by returning to the conceit of Kafka's story, or rather to my allegorical reading of it. The convergence of the new science, imagined by Kafka's canine researcher, with libido theory, as Freud introduces it apropos of oral pleasure, could perhaps be characterized this way. In each case, though perhaps less explicitly for Freud, in each case, an intimation of freedom arises from the experience of becoming the mouthpiece of a void. Put somewhat differently, the mouth becomes the site of an insistence of a void. And I'm spelling it ENCYSTANCE, from insist, like to insist something where the body takes something in and creates a cyst, insists it. So the mouth becomes the site of an insistence of a void, a site where a void is taken in and insisted in one's own embodied being. I've suggested that one might historicize this experience as part and parcel of what is generally referred to as the process of secularization, though with a twist. What both Kafka's canine science and Freud's libido theory preserve, and as it were redistribute along a plane of immanence, is not so much the dimension of a divine transcended being as that of the negativity of apophantic theology, the void of God in the sense of the subjective genitive, the void that belongs to God. Once the void of God in the sense of the objective genitive gets a grip on the imagination, what we refer to since Nietzsche as the death of God, the negative of negative theology, the God without qualities, passes into the texture of being. What thereby emerges might be called apophantic or negative ontology, or one say negative cosmology. And as both Kafka and Freud indicate, apophantic ontology can itself only be realized in relation to an apophatic or negative anthropology, one grounded in a gap or void in the constitution of the being of the human, in a hollow in this crown of creation. We might say that apophatic anthropology and apophatic ontology split the difference of apophatic theology, the difference of God from himself. So the negative of negative theology, so in a certain sense, secularization is not so much like relocating transcendence on the plane of immanence, but relocating the void, the divine void, the nothingness of negative theology into overlapping negativity, or negative ontology, some gap in the texture of being, and negative anthropology, some gap in the constitution of human being. What risks getting lost with the death of God is, in other words, not so much God's presence as the void that has kept the human soul in motion, suffering and rejoicing in the process of figuring it out. And I mean like figuring it out, like kind of researches, but also with figures, tropes, figuration, rhetorical excess. Prayer, doctrine, liturgy, myth, spiritual practices, all these researches of the human soul might thus be grasped as so many modes of participation in the excess of figuration in the neighborhood of zero with respect to divine being, the point at which God's pure self-reference repulses predication. Both Kafka and Freud suggest that with modernity, this neighborhood becomes that of the navel of our dreams, the dark ground out of which the dream work emerges as so many efforts to figure out, to pulsively theorize what is structurally inconsistent out there, what is not working in the texture of our social being, perhaps in nature itself. So, whereas I would say liturgy, doctrine, prayer, spiritual practices are in a certain sense figuring out something proper to God, the void proper to God. And now both Freud and Kafka have dispersed not transcendence, but a dimension of negativity. In a certain sense, they're preserving that negativity. And the danger is, in a certain sense, losing it. Not losing the presence of God, but losing a locus of a hot locus of negativity that keeps the soul in motion. My readings of Kafka and Freud converge here with the work of Niklaus Lagier, who reads the European tradition of mystical discourses and practices as experiential elaborations of apophantic theology, of fully registering, taking in and being taken in by, the void of knowledge constitutive of the encounter with the divine. In the mystical texts that form Lagier's primary archive, the void is realized in and through the excess of figuration circling around it. I'm sorry, I have to take this cough drop out of my mouth. Okay, let me repeat that. In the mystical texts that form Lagier's primary archive, the void, the void of apophantic theology, is realized in and through the excess of figuration circling around it. They elaborate ways of, as I have phrased it, figuring out this void, facilitating its circulation as a kind of persistent excitation, moving along chains of signifiers, affects, images, and thoughts that keep the mind open to what exceeds the intelligibility of the world as currently configured. His work provides a genealogical phenomenology of this transformation of an epistemological void with respect to divine transcendence into a rhetorical surplus, intensifying the domain of immanence, which thereby ceases to be a delimited domain, one still set off against immanence. Figuration serves here as a mode of what I call insistence, the way in which a void of knowledge comes to be insisted in the life of the subject, becomes the dark ground, the night of the world, out of which thinking, feeling, dreaming figure forth along waves, along pulses of jouissance. Along this new plane of immanence, a negative anthropology, that of the man without qualities, overlaps with a negative ontology, the inconsistent, incomplete, contradictory field of the other, to form the locus of an eternally recurring natality that Robert Musil referred to as Möglichkeitssinn, the sense of or feel for the possibility of new possibilities. Call it with Kafka, the freedom that is possible today, a stunted growth, but nevertheless freedom, nevertheless a possession. Thank you. I didn't have time to go into the Foucault part, this, about the Cynics, but, we could talk about that in the discussion if people want to.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. It was a really wonderfully rich talk that also, I think, sets us guessing about the connections that you're going to make in the rest of this work to theory and indeed the connection to your previous work about creatureliness. But I'm going to turn to my colleagues who have been tasked with setting the conversation going, and I'm throwing them in at the deep end a little bit. So your thoughts, comments are very welcome. Just before I turn to you, Josh, first of all, I'll just remind our participants that you can put your questions and comments in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to come to as many of those as we possibly can in the time we have left. So, Josh, are you ready to make some comments and response?
Yeah, could we maybe just take less than a minute just to, I'll just gather, and might give everybody also who's watching and listening a chance to gather their thoughts together and maybe think about how they'd like to intervene. So I'm just going to gather.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to, yeah. Okay. Well, I want to begin by thanking Eric for an extraordinarily lucid journey along a series of parallel paths between literature, theology, philosophy, and of course, psychoanalysis. And one of the difficulties in responding directly is that the presentation sort of, in a way, presents itself in Proust's or Benjamin Proust's correspondence as a sort of a series of almost parallel intellectual journeys layered in one very tightly packed theoretical sentence. So thinking about exactly where to start is difficult, but I suppose I'll go with type and start from psychoanalysis and start specifically from the three essays, the wonderful readings in the three essays. And one of the passages that was evoked for me was one of the prefaces. I think it's probably the fourth edition preface. I think it comes in 1915, but it might be 1920. So if it's 1920, it's very close to the Forschungen. And I wish I had the text in front of me. Actually, I don't. This is another, of course, of the vagaries of COVID. But he speaks there of the objection, the common objection to psychoanalysis and the privilege that it accords to sexuality, as rendering everything sexual, making everything all about sex. And he goes on to say that this is a nonsensical objection. What you expect him to do then is to refute the objection by showing how psychoanalysis is not all about sex, which he signally and quite provokingly fails to do. In fact, he says that it's no more all about sex than Plato is all about sex. In other words, he says, yes, it is indeed all about sex. It's just that rather than remain in a kind of restricted conception of sexuality, which we might call, I think, a kind of sense certainty, right? Going back to the reference in the paper to Hegel, that the version of sex that we get in the kind of garden variety critique of Freudian sexuality is reproaching Freud with a notion of sexuality which is precisely not his. A sense certainty version of sexuality which can be reduced to a series of determinate behaviors, to a kind of delimited region of experience that happens in certain places, that is localized at certain parts of the body. And of course, this is exactly what psychoanalysis is undoing over the course of its long life. It's undoing a kind of localized, sense certain version of sexuality. And this is what he gives us a sort of glimmer of in the preface, that what he's actually offering is sexuality as an access to every metric every rationality. Now, the other association I had was to Jean Laplanche's discussion. In his first book, sort of prior to, if you like, Laplanche proper, and the theory of the enigmatic other, Laplanche's extraordinary early readings in the Life and Death drives, Life and Death in Psychoanalysis, where he makes this distinction, which I think offers another sort of homology alongside or layered above or beneath Eric's various layered homologies. The distinction between the vital and the sexual order. When the dog comes on the scene in the story, he, in a way, introduces us to what Laplanche calls a vital order. What is the vital order? The vital order is indeed the order of nutrition. But again, nutrition thought about at the level of sense certainty. That is, nutrition as precisely not drive, but instinct, as an appetite that is aroused and then satisfied in a very straightforward biological process. It is satisfied by some form of nutrition. But what happens, and what is recapitulated in the moment of thumb sucking, is that when the baby takes the breast, the nutritive or vital order is immediately broken in on by another experience, which is the breaking of the milk over the baby's lips, the encounter of the baby's tongue with the sensual surfaces of the breast and the nipple. And so another order breaks into the vital, the sexual order. And this excess, which seems to be supplementary, which seems to be sort of a second order in time, is effectively simultaneous with the vital order. In other words, it isn't effectively possible to differentiate. In a way, this is what the phenomenologist discovers immediately. He begins his inquiries, his researches into sense certainty. The possibility of sense certainty sort of comes undone, because sense certainty is discovered immediately to be divided from itself, which I think is very much the story of the dog. As soon as the dog tries to join the sort of the common order of dogdom and experience nutrition at a sense certain level, something breaks in on the order of nutrition that forces him to consider its excess, and that seems to set him apart from those who can just sort of take food as food. So those are my sort of initial associations to Eric's extraordinarily rich paper, and I suppose if there's a question that I haven't quite yet been able to formulate about the relationship of the psychoanalytic to the theological. And maybe I could sort of hand over to Julia at this point and try and formulate what that would be, because
yeah, you'll need a few minutes for that one, I should think.
I think I might.
Just about 2. Yeah. So, Eric, would you like to respond to those things first of all, or shall we let Julia add a few remarks and you take them all together? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
A few things that just come to mind. I really appreciate your response and your questions. So, I mean, and this would maybe a way to get toward the, to make a transition to the theological. What I'm trying to, I'm trying to coordinate or correlate the, what you just described about the dog's phenomenological discoveries, which are also, I think, psychoanalytic discoveries about the object of the, about the vital and the sexual, that the sexual is already inhabiting, is the vital is already sexual from the start in some sense, the way sense certainty is already split in itself, the way the problem of food, as he notes, already involves incantations, music, as it already involves music. I mean, there are other various ways to put this, but I want to correlate that with this obvious, glaring conceit of the story that there are no humans, and yet there are humans. So, in a certain sense, it's like the question is, we could, as it were, bracket out that enigma entirely, and just talk about, the dog's life and the discoveries the dog makes. But I don't think it doesn't make sense to not to see the enigmas as in some correlation to the absence of the human, the absence of the a realm of being, of human being. And so things that that would not have been enigmatic had the okay, humans bring there is providence. Food is provided for. We bark and our masters, come to us and, feed us. And almost every detail could work. Sometimes food comes at a slant. It doesn't come directly down. So, I do that, I'll throw some food toward my dog and she'll catch it. So everything in a way is that is utterly mysterious to the dog, to dogs, seems to be, the enigmas seem generated by a bracketing out of, maybe it's a phenomenological bracketing out of the dimension of providence. But it's hard for me then not to wonder, okay, part of it is, is Kafka talking about, human life that has lost all reference to the divine and now just has, worldly being and human being, and we try to make everything make sense in that context. And we discover impasses. And the question, would those impasses not be there had we had the reference to God? Or one could say it's more specific to Kafka as a secular Jew who, in a certain sense, is touched by the tradition, has some contact with the tradition, with the source. I mean, there are all these references in the story to the sources that are in some sense lost. So, in a certain sense, it's like the situation of that Shalom describes. There's revelation, but it's nothing. It's completely empty. So in either way, there is a withdrawal of the theological is there in its withdrawal. But what I'm trying to say is that the problem is that in a certain sense the divine is not lost if the negative finds a new location that could be elaborated and figured, and that there is a freedom, that a margin of freedom that remains if we could redistribute, as it were, the negative of negative theology. Let's say the split in God, between his physis and his metaphysis, that and realize that, or not realize, but that in other words, the enigmas didn't begin with the disappearance of, with the death of God. We lost a locus for elaborating a negativity, for circling a void, for insisting a void. And now the problem in secular life is, where are those practices where the void is insisted, and how do we insist upon the void now? So in a certain sense, it's I guess I'm interested if I guess it helps me to think about the dream work. Let me just talk about Freud. It helps me to think about the dream work, what Freud means by the navel of the dream, if I link it up to negative theology and the practices of as it were, circling around the void of knowledge about God, an impossible knowledge about God, and prayer, and liturgical practices and religious practices are, as it were, like where the density of the dream work, the dream work gets so dense around it, like Freud says, around the navel of the dream. And then he uses the mushroom analogy, which I forget at the moment. So, in other words, it's Freud is discovering something that at an historical moment when it seems like I guess he's recuperating with the notion of the drive, something, that's why I'm calling it psychotheological. So I guess I want to hold on to that, that link, that he's there's a psychotheological dimension to the drive, and it has to do not with God's being, but with God's negativity. That would be. And so Freud elaborates an apophatic anthropology. That is, there's a gap, a split in the human. And that's why we have drive rather than instinct.
Yeah, I mean, just to come back on one point there, which I think is why I had the association to the preface, because what Freud is saying to his critics in that moment is, you think that your objection to my theory of sexuality is an objection to a theory of instinct. What you actually don't like about it is that it's a theory of drive. In other words, that it's exactly the opposite of what you think it is. You think you don't like the positive theory of sexuality, it's the negative.
But at some level, it's another way of putting it. It says you have your anthropology is not apophatic.
Right.
That the theory of the drive is in a certain sense is a kind of anthropology, but it's an apophatic anthropology, and that creates that engenders the drive. That is, there's a void of knowledge. There's a constitutive void. The energy around the drive is not responsive to is not a motive response to homeostatic imperatives, but a response to a void that, in a certain sense, that is insisted within a response to homeostatic imperatives. And thus, even the study of nutrition is already, as it were, a mode of insistence. That is, it's already secreting the void, insisting a void. Which then, we could say culture music is sort of more openly, figuring. It's about something unnameable, unsayable, and that we're in a certain sense, that's the flourishes of culture, is, as it were, where we engage with the excess over mere flourishing.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I don't know, Eric, if you can see the questions that are coming through on the Q&A. Julia, is it okay if we just take some of these questions before we come to you?
Yeah,
Eric,
absolutely.
It
Yeah,
would
go
save
ahead.
time if you can see those. Eric, are they visible to you?
Yes. Well, the first one, Elena.
Yeah.
About Beckett. I did actually have. I reread the story last night, and the Kafka story, and then I didn't realize quite how Beckettian it was. And I think actually it was from reading it in English. I read it in translation last night, just to, it's just, I could do it more quickly. And since I only read Beckett really in English, I think that helped. And I could imagine all these exercises, all these experiments, really as kind of, things that, any one of Beckett's characters, from the trilogy, would be engaged in. It's almost like you could imagine the dog engaging with playing with stones, counting stones. But there again, so it's like there's it's a kind of science, it's a kind of research, but it's research that is, that leans on determinate problems, determinate questions, but is ultimately a way of being in relation to a void. Sort of establishing the proper, sort of a livable relation or constantly shifting relation to, the unnameable or some unknowable least. All this language that that really in Beckett sounds like a kind of calculus, approaching zero. Sort of what is knowledge approaching zero? What is life approaching zero? And what is revelation approaching the zero of content? So in a certain sense, it's as if, a different form, different ways of living, find ways of operating in the neighborhood of zero, or include a dimension of operating in working in the neighborhood of zero. And the problem is that in that politically, socially, historically, we get compelled. We find ourselves compelled to not figure out the void, but in a certain sense, become responsible for it. So we're not so it's as if we're not elaborating a void, we're working to pay off. We become, we're put in a kind of debt with respect to the void. We owe something. There's this void, and it gets turned into a demand, a demand for work. Freud calls the drive a demand for work, but it becomes a demand for work in the service of a certain organization of society. And in a way, it's like what Freud's understanding of sexuality, understanding of the drive, and I think what Beckett's work does, and I think what Kafka work does, it brings us into a different relation to the void that is where, in a certain sense, the freedom that's still, that the dog discovers at the end is a freedom that's opened by, in a way, rendering not ceasing to figure out, to encircle the void, but not to allow that to be converted into service, work in service of its, let's say, repair, redemption, resolution, filling, elimination. I'm preparing a seminar right now on the Weimar period. I'm reading Ernst Jünger's book, The Worker, Der Arbeiter. And he has this concept of total mobilization. And, it really does seem all about the fantasy that work can fully fill all of human capacities, that there's no void, there's no deficit, there's no scarcity, but it's all about total organization, and it is it, but it does seem to be in somehow a response to this same dimension, but he thinks he has a way out, a way beyond it, and I think the freedom that the dog finds, and I think the freedom that Freud finds in sort of separating the symptoms from, finding in the symptoms our insistence of a void, and letting that our insistence be uncoupled from our symptoms. So our symptoms, your symptoms aren't working to fill a void. In a certain sense, they're a way of covering up, a deeper insistence that I think belongs to human life. Mm-hmm. Of course, and then historically we've had these other ways of living our insistence, and I think negative theology was I think one locus in which our insistence was not, the insistence of a void was, I don't know, there was a socially intelligible way, a collective and social intelligible way of insisting. And it seems like now everyone is, kind of forced to insist on their own. And then, so that's what, it gets individualized. But I've kind of spun out of control a bit myself. So.
No, it's fascinating. And I think you've started to answer some of the other questions that people are posing as you talk. I wonder if we should give Julia a chance to, I think she had prepared a question or two for you.
Oh, no, I don't have to, because actually I'm looking over the questions and they're extremely rich. I mean, I had basically a rather small question, really just about the very final sentence and what you made of the word besitz, the possession, like what kind of possession is this, that is this freedom with which Kafka ends the story. And I guess I'm asking this because, it's coupled with like the very peculiar phrase, freilich die Freiheit, wie sie heute möglich ist, ein kümmerliches Gewächs, right? So I think I have also a translation in front of me, that the Moore's translation, where basically it's a wretched business, which is not really a translation of what's going on here. It's also a form of life, I guess. I mean, I think what's curious to me is that this freedom, as far as it is still, it is possible today, is this miserable growth of some sort. And it's specifically not really a void in that case. I mean, I'm just wondering, is this part of what you mean by the generative void, the void that's, because here at the end of this, at the very end, this is coupled with, I think, in your association with the sort of emerging theory of libidinal economy, this is the words, these are the words, the freedom rather, right, is what is associated with the generative quality of the void, qua negative theology, qua the insistence via Scholem, you know, whatever context he's speaking of course, that's a bit more complicated, of the reduction of not just commandment, but prophecy specifically also to its 0 point. But so I guess I was just really wondering, like, what you made of exactly the wording in Kafka's story, because it seems like it's not quite just the negation that appears in one form qua negation in the overlapping with another discourse that then sort of generates the theory. It's specifically another kind of form of life. Is it a hybrid life? For what purpose is this a besitz, a possession? I mean, there's a number of different things I could so think of that maybe sort of also gesture to this very sort of complicated notion of a theology that is somehow rendered theological qua its appearance within its secularization, which I think is sort of what I understood from the reference to Benjamin Scholem's discussions of the place of the revelation in Kafka. And of course, I mean, that brings to mind a whole, like another kind of overlapping sort of that maybe hybridizes also, again, the exact nature of the negative in their use of the word 0. And that is in Kafka's own words with regard to messianism, that the messianic will come, it's just, you know, it's never at the right time. It's a thing, right? It's a kind of a gevex, but the weightiness of it, so the concerns of the misery that it brings about is sort of associated with the non-necessity of it. So it's a kind of misery because it's almost like a possession that one cannot use specifically. And perhaps that has to do with the word besitz in this final sentence, right? It's a besitz that you can't use. You know, it's a form of life that is not usable in a very specific way. So I'm wondering how this, sorry, this got really long. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to have this like long statement. I actually meant to like give space to the other people in the audience, but I mean, how does this fit in with like the generative quality of the theory that I think you were trying to link with Freud, specifically from this point of this last ending gesture on the freedom?
That was great. I mean, I think part of what's kümmerlich, you know, what's miserable or, you know, a poor growth, you know, a stunted growth. I mean, in a certain sense, how, what are the conditions for actually living freedom? You know, for elaborating one's sense of possibilities, Möglichkeitssinn. It certainly requires, you know, community. It requires others. It requires, in other words, I wouldn't say he's in a form of life. It's like he's, it has to do with, you know, somehow that has to be shared. Another way of thinking about it is like, if, you know, to link it to the messianic, how, you know, it's like a messianism without, like without reference to God, without reference to divinity. Which is a stunted, you know, which is a stunted messianism. It's a stunted growth. So yeah, okay, it's you could look at it. Okay, fine, it's a possession. You have it. Fine. It's in a way it is useless. That's another way of thinking about it. Yet another way I think that relates it to Freud is that I almost think of this: what is the freedom that comes with, let's say, a therapeutic process, as opposed to a revolutionary process? So I think that it's, and again, to some extent, this has to do with, I almost want to say the dimension of scholarship, of research, that that the dog is involved in, and that we're involved in, and that when we have these breakthroughs, and in a certain sense, they're my reading is, I feel like I've accomplished something, but okay, it really is a kümmerliches Gewächs. Okay, but I have it, and it'll be on my CV. And I mean, there's some way in which these achievements they open up, and we all talk. Okay, there's an opening, and that, but where it also, there's something inert about it, insofar as it remains, unter uns, in the context of the university, in the context of our intellectual life, or in Freud's, in the merely therapeutic, and I think that's it may, compared to someone like Benjamin. I think Benjamin is kind of I think appreciates all of this, but wants to see everything that we're talking about in its potential as in its revolutionary potential. He's a thinker not of the therapeutic, but of the revolutionary. The opening would be explosive, whereas for in Kafka, it's I don't think it is, and for Freud, I don't think it is, and I think I'm also not a revolutionary thinker. So I think I share, the dog's ambivalence at the end. That okay, I've opened something up, but okay, great. I have it. I've written it. But it's at least that. So there's a kind of satisfaction, but it's also a recognition that there's something just inert about it, that it's not being used, that the question is how to use it, how to put it to use. And I think that's all, and it's interesting that I think like all of Agamben's work seems to be about, okay, how do you use these openings? How do you then develop a new sense of using things, a relationship to bodies, to objects. And so I haven't actually addressed at all the notion, the dimension of use. Now, the Foucault's writings about the Cynics go in that direction, but it's really by way of a form of life that is constant, that is in a certain sense always on display. It's like living a dog's life in public, and constantly disturbing the peace. So it's like, as it were, if the dog, in Kafka's story, then went out into the world, or stood at the corner, went into the public square, and he does to some extent seem to do that, ask people questions. But for Foucault, it would be the question of what is a true life, in this world. What is a true life? Are you living the true life? And so that would be, maybe then at that point, it would no longer be a possession. It would be, as it were, it would be on the way to becoming, in a way, part of the commons. It would be available. It would be shareable, mitteilbar, divisible, communicable, shareable. But in Kafka, it doesn't seem to be the case.
Eric, can I pose a question from the audience for you? I'm looking at them in reverse order here, because this last question is sort of trying to push you to say maybe a bit more about the wider project. The question is, from your talk, an outline of theory seems to be surfacing that's defined by its property of missing or deviating from its object. In psychoanalysis, this missing is the object is methodological, insofar as we're talking about the clinic. However, with reference to theory as theory, do you think the strangeness of this strange science will disallow all possibilities of nutrition, or is there an alternate form of nutrition that you can envisage in the figurations? In other words, could you elaborate on the nature of nutrition that one gets by missing the object?
Well, I think part of what I mean, at the end of the chapter, I think it's in infantile sexuality. I can't find it right now. But he talks about the reverse, I mean, it's sort of obvious, but the way, okay, so we talked about how the sexual object emerges at the site of nutrition, and then thumb sucking, and then basically oral drive, the mouth becomes an erotogenic zone. And that then can be communicated to language, to our pleasure in language, let's say poetry. But he also says that let's say the emergence of sexuality can go backwards to its origin and then become a kind of disturbance to the nutritive, to the vital. It could go in different extremes. You could become a glutton, you could become anorexic. But in all cases, I think he's saying is that what happens is that the sexual as a mode of insistence starts impacting the vital sphere, in a way returns to the vital sphere, or becomes attacks the vital sphere, so that you want to sustain the void, no food, or you want to fill the void, constantly fill it. It's not fillable, gluttony. I mean, so I would say that eating disorders, at least in a Freudian way, in this limited Freudian sense, are in a certain ways in which our eating comes to be a mode of insistence. And so in a certain sense, we have nutritional disorientation. Just like in a certain sense, Freud seems to be saying there's no proper sexual orientation. It's possible that there's no nutritive orientation, and it is like, how much is enough food? When is it too much? That, and so there's something is, it's like the vital sphere, the homeostatic imperatives are thrown off a bit. So there's a kind of deregulation from, sexual deregulation of the nutritive. And it could be endless. You never stop. There's never enough, or it's always too much. I was thinking, of Mary Trump's book about her uncle, Too Much and Never Enough. It's like, it's sort of like the problem. But so I'm not sure, like, I don't know if this is an answer, but I think that Freud would say, insofar as we're sexual beings, eating is always strange. It will never, it will never cease to be strange. So, but that's also a kind of freedom. We could, we in a certain sense, we get to spiritualize food. Food can come to mean all kinds of things, because it's been cleaved in a certain sense from a purely biological, from doing purely biological service. So the homeostatic imperative is now, there's a kind of stasis within it, a kind of static, that's now always there, and we're always negotiating with it. And so I think that, are there creative ways of doing that? Or are there ways in which we just suffer it? Are in a certain sense, enslaved to a demand for work that's attached itself to our nutritive function. I have to eat more,
So
or I have to starve more.
Is that the analogy with theory then? Thinking about your autobiographical aspect of this project and looking at the books behind you, is there an analogy that you're making with theory? And because I think this question is about, what do we get? What's nutritious for theorists from theory? Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's not nutritious. It's in a certain sense, it's about, again, it's like what I said at one point in the talk. It's the discovery of, in a way, the what it is to be a mouthpiece of a void, which and it seems like theory is, at least in the tradition of theory that I'm interested in, is somehow always, I remember Charlie Bernheimer, who was a scholar of Kafka and Flaubert, wrote something very critical about post-structuralism, probably 30 years ago. And he called it all a form of avoidance, a void dance, a dance around the void. But he also thought it was avoiding, basically problems of human life, because there was an obsession with the void. And I think there's something right about it, but I think that it depends how you dance, and I think that it's not that you could ever cease, that the dance ever ceases, that there's ever a possibility of not dancing, but you can know that you could, in a certain sense, discover new dance. It's a little bit like, going back to the basic, yeah, I'm getting a bit lost.
Yeah.
Like when
I feel that we're working terribly hard with these questions, but maybe we'll just finish with this one from Liam Jackson that's on the Q&A, because I think it's a lovely question, where he writes, I was wondering about your thoughts on revelation for disclosure as an excess of figuration. In the trial, Kafka describes how those touched by the law become beautiful and are bestowed with a kind of glow. In this sense, the commandment is not only contentless, but exists through its consequences. It becomes predicated or becomes only a predicate. Like Rilke's truth is monstrous.
Yeah, in the trial, it's Joseph K. in a way becomes attractive. Because he's been, because he was arrested. Okay, so he's been touched by the law. So he's, yeah, I'm not sure I have, well, let me put it this way. I think that glow, I mean, was it calling glow, or, aura, or dux in the sense of glory. I think are, it's sort of like what I said about, the negative theology, like the mystical practices, the spiritual exercises were, in a certain sense, getting totally mobilized around the void of God, in a way becoming attuned to what exceeds knowledge by excessively figuring. In the same way that I think that Freud says the dream work is, the work is an excess of figuration with respect to something unknown in the dream, the navel of the dream. And what people forget, even psychoanalysts forget, is they think that the dream, that the key to the dream is the latent dream thought, moving from the manifest dream to the latent dream thought, where he says the essence of dream is the dream work. And what I'm saying, dream work is a mode of insistence, that is, which is very much like the activities of the mystics of apophantic theology, that is, excessively figuring the unnameable, the unknowable dimension of God that is beyond predicates, the God without qualities. And this is, in other words, it keeps the soul in motion. It keeps now that being kept in motion could also be a kind of prison, a kind of meaningless activity. In fact, there's this famous, I quoted often this parable of Kafka's. They were given the choice to become kings or messengers. Just like children, they all chose to be messengers. For this reason, there are only messengers. They race through the world, and because there are no kings, they cry out to one another announcements that have become meaningless. They would happily put an end to their miserable life, but because of their oath of office, they don't dare. So we could say the place of the king is now, it's like it's gone. The king is gone, but the messengers are still in constant motion, as it were, excessively signifying the king who's no longer there. How did they turn the activity into something else? No longer in the service of no longer bound by an oath of office. The oath of office is a way of binding an excess of figuration with respect to a gap in knowledge, with respect to a void of knowledge. It seems that that sort of cultural struggle, political struggle, always involves, in some sense, an attempt to, maybe to go back to Julia, to turn that void into a possession, and to, in a certain sense, to take charge of it, and compel others to discharge, to discharge the excess of, all this excess work, this excess activity, this to be driven. I mean, another way of thinking about it is like, the ceaseless activity of the ceaseless drive of capital. It's as if there's, or when we get, okay, now I'm going off. Now, again, I have this tendency to get a bit lost. I'm thinking of a subject. I don't know if Aaron Schuster is involved in the call, is in the webinar, but the two of us taught a seminar together at Chicago, which we called after a very nice neologism of his, the debt drive. And it was basically, just reading about neoliberalism, theories of debt. We read Lazzarato, the making of indebted man. And it seems one of the things that indebtedness is a way of binding people to a drive, turning debt in, turning activity with respect to a void into a debt that could be paid. That there's something unredeemable, and capitalism finds way to make people, to bind people to the repayment, the paying off of an impossible debt, a debt that's not determinate, and yet it's made determinate, or at least it's transformed into something that appears determinate, that we could then work, we could then do meaningful work, purposeful work. But at some level, our purposeful work at its core is not purposeful. It's a mode of insistence, around a void that's not a determinate debt. It's not a determinate scarcity. It's and so the activity around it that seems reasonable, we're paying off something, we have a determinate deficit that we can address, that we actually could even feel guilty about. Schuld, debt, in German is Schuld and debt. I mean, Schuld is debt and guilt. So we could be captured, as it were, and then as it were, we make an oath. We've made an oath to pay off the debt. So, and it almost seems like Kafka wants to imagine freeing the messengers from the oath of office, but that doesn't mean they would disappear or they would just stop. They could be reconfigured. They would have a share of freedom with respect to the absent place of the king. And not only an absent place because the king is dead and the new king, there's something, a hollow, in the crown itself, that's not just the absence of a particular incumbent. There's a hollowness in, a void in the institution of kingship that the king is dead, long live the king, elaborates, turns into a determinate, interregnum. This king is dead, there's another king, but it's always the gap of the king is always the gap of a particular king, rather than that kingship is organized around, a different kind of void, and I think that, I know there's no time to do this, but in the book, I talk a bit about Richard II and the scene in which the Queen, when Richard II is off in Ireland, putting down the rebellion, the Queen, is being entertained by the king's entourage, by Bushy, and Bushy says, that she is too much sad. There's an excess of sorrow. And he keeps on saying, Richard will be back. And she says, that's not it. I know my sorrow is out of proportion to any determinate cause. And one could interpret it that she has there's a foreshadowing of Richard's deposition. But she in a certain sense, she insists that her grief is a mode of insistence. That is, that there's she calls it a nameless what. There's a nameless grieving, a nameless loss. And the institution of kingship is one way in which we live with that nameless loss, that nameless, it's not even a loss because there was nothing to lose. It's a gap, a void. And the parade of determinate kings, of particular kings, it's, then we think of Richard's, let us tell the sad story of kings, on the Welsh coast. And then he says, then he talks about the hollow in the crown, where the antic sits and, allows the king to monarchize a bit, or we might say today to monetize a bit. But really there's a kind of fundamental scarcity that's not a determinate deficit. And so that becomes visible in crises of kingship. So what Richard, it's not just a particular struggle between two kings, between two dynasties or two political, it's what becomes visible is, an emptiness at the core of the institution. And the queen's grief, the queen is basically saying, my sorrow is responding to that. So it's too much. There's a too much sadness.
Eric, I could listen to you all evening, I think, but we are out of time, and I think that we should bring the session to a close for the sake of the recording, at least. So we are indebted to you. I was going to say that anyway. And you can choose how we repay it. But thank you so much for such rich work, and we're really looking forward to read the book and see this part of it in the context of
how it gets all untied together.
Yeah, tied, untied. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks. I can't. I'm sorry. It's so strange not to see people, but goodbye.
Thanks everybody for all of your really very rich questions as well.